Hey gang, Volty here bringing you some educational content. There's going to be a lot more educational content coming to the channel very soon, and this particular video is going to be followed by a series of videos, but we're going to be talking about sideboards today. Now this is a very common thing that comes up. I don't know how to build a sideboard, I don't know what cards are good for my sideboard, and it's very, very easy to lose a lot of equity in a 7-point tournament because your sideboard is inadequate. Now this particular presentation is going to be geared towards 7-point, however some of the learnings in here will be applicable across formats, so it's something to keep in mind as we go through it. So why does your sideboard matter? Now, obviously, your sideboard is an extension of your main deck, and it's always going to matter because Magic is a best of 3 game. However, in 7-point particularly, your sideboard is more potent than in a lot of the other formats. In Modern or in Standard, it's entirely possible that you're board in 2, maybe 3 cards in any given matchup. In Highlander, I've seen upwards of 9 or 10. So making sure that your sideboard is well built is a very good key to success. So the first point, there is a large pool of deck archetypes. Now this matters a lot because there are lots of ways you can think about your sideboard and what cards you put in it. However, it's very easy to accidentally leave a gap in your sideboard. So we'll take the graveyard for example. There are lots and lots of graveyard decks, and there are lots of decks that use the graveyard, and those two are not the same thing. So a graveyard deck is something like Reanimator or Dredge. A deck that uses the graveyard ranges anywhere from a Delve deck that uses Murktide Regent, for example, any deck that's casting Flage out of the graveyard, any deck that's casting Grist, for example. There are lots of ways to use the graveyard, but then there are also graveyard decks. And what you put in your sideboard will depend on what you expect and how you plan on fighting them. Point 2, there is a very diverse pool of card types. So in most formats, you'll encounter the same types of cards across most of your matchups. There'll be creatures, there'll be spells, maybe there'll be planeswalkers. In Highlander, there are decks that play 20 plus enchantments. There are decks where every single card in the deck is an artifact or a land. And making sure that you can cover these diverse card types is meaningful because, it's very easy to go, I'm going to deal with creatures, but if those creatures are very different sizes, or some of them are enchantments, or some of them aren't always creatures, then, you're going to run into problems. High average impact per card. So this is important in that if your sideboard cards aren't up to snuff, then you're going to be lowering the average impact of your cards per game. So when you think about Highlander, it's a vintage legal format. And so most people are playing the best 60 cards for their archetype in their main deck. This skyrockets the average power level of your cards, which therefore increases the average impact of your cards as well. If your sideboard has low impact cards, every time you bring one of those in and take one of your high average impact cards out, you're weakening your deck overall. So it's something to keep in mind as well. Higher complexity within game states. So what this means, practically speaking, is that there are a lot of mechanics that exist in Highlander that don't exist in other formats, and there's a lot of niche interactions that you simply won't come across. Plenty of them are present in Legacy and Vintage, but if you're coming from Modern or Standard, these things don't tend to come up very often. Examples of this are the Initiative, the Monarchy. We have things like Land Hate, for example, and having condensed board states in terms of mana. Cards like Choke, cards like Blood Moon, cards like Back to Basics, for example. Even minute things like Strip Mine versus Basics or Wasteland versus Basics and Fetch Lands versus Stifle, you're generally going to encounter more complex interactions in a game of Highlander than any of the other non-Eternal formats. What this then means for your sideboard is that each of your sideboard cards has to be somewhat equipped to battle in this field of complexity. If you're bringing in a card from your sideboard that's very simple and does the same thing every time, it may not cut it. You might need something a bit more flexible or a bit more targeted. And lastly, the higher percentage of dead cards in your main deck. What this means is that most mid-range decks play a large number of creature removal spells. There are plenty of decks that have a pretty large suite of counter magic as well. And then there are heaps of matchups where you're just going to end up with cards in your main deck that you can't play. You can't keep them in post-board because Fatal Push has no targets, or because your mana dorks don't size up very well, or your Planeswalker that costs 5 just isn't ever going to resolve. So making sure that some of your sideboard cards have the ability to be boarded in a large range of matchups to take out for those dead cards is pretty meaningful. So it's something to think about as well. So what makes a sideboard card? In terms of definitions, technically speaking, anything can go into your sideboard, but for the purposes of this presentation as well as upcoming content around this, I have my own personal rules for what I define as a sideboard card. This is flexible, and plenty of cards that will show up in the main deck 80-90% of the time can be considered potential sideboard cards for particular strategies. So for example, a lower floor and a higher ceiling. If your card has a very low floor in some situations, or in most situations, and an incredibly high ceiling, and those situations are things you expect to occur, then that would make it a sideboard card. Pyroblast and the other 3 blasts are probably the best example of this. If your opponent doesn't have blue permanents or blue cards, Pyroblast does nothing. The floor is all the way to the bottom, it's just a dead piece of cardboard. If your opponent has blue cards and has blue permanents, Pyroblast is a 1-mana Vindicate, a 1-mana counterspell. It's incredibly flexible and it's incredibly potent. So it's the classic example of a sideboard card, but understanding this ideology can then be applied to other sideboard cards and other cards that you may not have previously considered to go into your sideboard. Dedicated hate cards against zones or strategies. If a card, this is very similar to the first point, if a card has a very low floor but a high ceiling, because it's a dedicated hate card and needs to come into a certain matchup, but you need to encounter that matchup for it to have any text, then that's going to count as a sideboard card. The easiest way to separate this is Rest in Peace versus Scavenging Ooze. Rest in Peace has no text if your opponent is not planning on using their graveyard. Scavenging Ooze always has text. It is literally always, at minimum, a grizzly bear, which is a piece of cardboard. A Rest in Peace is a 0-mana enchantment that isn't interacting with opponent's graveyard, has no text. It can't attack, can't block, can't do anything. Now, obviously, this is a very extreme example. However, it's a very easy way to view where cards usually should be sitting across your 75 and what impact you expect to get out of those cards. Scavenging Ooze has a high floor, but its ceiling is pretty capped because it's very mana intensive. Rest in Peace you can fire off and just ignore it, and if your opponent blows it up, then you can reset and reevaluate what you're going to do about their graveyard. The ability to pivot and present sideboard dukes. Now, I've put Tarmogoyf as an example here, and I think this is really important. Tarmogoyf is going to appear in most deck lists, at least 70 to 80% of them, as a main board card. It's good, it always hits pretty hard, it's always pretty big, it does the same thing most of the time. However, if you are playing a dedicated control deck and you have very few creatures in your main deck, resolving a Tarmogoyf on 2 provides a completely different angle of attack that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. So obviously, you could put the Tarmogoyf in the main deck, but that's the game that your opponent is going to have Fatal Push and Swords to Plowshares in their deck. If they're planning on cutting them in the post-board games because you killed them with a Jace the Mind Sculptor, Tarmogoyf's equity skyrockets, and you have the ability to win a game that you otherwise wouldn't. This is only going to apply to the cream of the crop, realistically. There are plenty of dukes that are just too weak, and there are plenty of ways to pivot your deck that weakens it or dilutes it too much. However, there is a small subset of cards that are just important enough and impactful enough by themselves within the context of your opponent's sideboarding cards out and you sideboarding cards out and in. Matchup-specific impact. So there are plenty of cards that fall into a category where they're very good in some matchups and very bad in some matchups. In general, if a card has a lower floor than you would like, but it has a high enough ceiling for particular matchups, and this isn't an example of dedicated hate cards like Rest in Peace, this is for generically powerful cards that could be in your main deck, but that your main deck won't support well enough in terms of creating some kinds of matchups. So I've listed Court of Garenbrig here, and I'll go through that. Court of Garenbrig introduces the Monarchy. It's also an enchantment that buffs your mana dorks, for example, or buffs your other creatures, and allows you to put pressure on. If you're in game 1, and you're playing a deck with a lot of mana dorks, and you introduce the Monarchy, if your opponent is on a control deck, they're probably just dead. If your opponent is on a combo deck, you're probably just dead. And if your opponent is on a mid-range deck, their creatures might just size up too largely, and introducing the Monarchy is going to lose you the game. So despite the card being individually powerful, and having an impact that is very simple and very easy to understand and execute, it's entirely possible that your particular deck should be playing the card in the sideboard, despite it not being a dedicated anti-control card. It's not Veil of Summer, it's not a counterspell, it's not a Red Elemental Blast, but if you resolve it on 2 off a mana dork, the control player is just dead. And lastly, we have niche interaction and removal. There are plenty of cards that could easily end up in your main deck, however, you just don't have enough space for them. You've got too many cards that do a certain thing, and this particular card does a similar thing, but has certain upside, but is more conditional, for example. So Force of Vigor is listed here, however, there's lots of examples of this. Playing Endurance in your sideboard and playing Scavenging Ooze in your main deck is a pretty classic example of this. Playing a white removal spell like Prismatic Ending in your sideboard when you expect your opponent to be siding in weird permanents because you're on Breach, for example, is another example. So how do you choose your sideboard? These are the general facets that I try to stick to whenever I build sideboards. Making sure that you understand what you're trying to get out of each slot is going to be one of the easiest ways to avoid problems down the road. So for point 1, ensure appropriate coverage across zones and archetypes. What this means is that every zone in Magic, in terms of the graveyard, exile, library, hand, and the stack, and the battlefield, all of them show up some percentage across all games. Realistically, the graveyard, the battlefield, and the hand are going to be the most common, and they're things that you should be aware of. So it's one thing to go, I've got some main deck graveyard hate, like a Scavenging Ooze or a Lion Sash, I'm good. It's another thing to say, I really can't beat certain graveyard strategies, maybe I should be playing more than one graveyard hate piece in the sideboard. So it's the numbers and it's the tweaking. That's really how you're going to get the most value out of your sideboard slots. Avoid diluting your general game plan. It's very easy to over sideboard. That's true for every single format. It's very easy to board in 9 cards for a particular matchup and suddenly making your deck weaker in an already good matchup. A classic example of this is Veil of Summer in formats like Modern, for example. If you bring in too many Veil of Summers, it's going to be harder for you to actually put your combo together because you have more blanks in your deck. So, if you need one Veil of Summer to protect a combo, that's very doable by playing 2 or 3. but if you have all 4, you're more likely to have 2 of them in your hand and be missing a combo piece. General purpose cards greater than hyper niche options. This seems obvious enough, but it's something worth discussing. There are plenty of cards in Magic, across 7 especially, that you can bring in against a large variety of decks. There are also cards that are incredibly powerful in some matchups, but complete bricks in similar matchups. So for example, I want to be beating creature decks, and I'm in black. So I want to play Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge is, in general, going to be good against most aggressive decks. However, I show up to my weeklies, I play against goblins over and over again, and my Toxic Deluge isn't good enough. So I'm going to swap it out for Engineered Plague or Plague Engineer. Suddenly, all of those other aggressive decks aren't being checked by your Toxic Deluge slot because they have different creature types and your Plague Engineer isn't doing anything. In general, I would hedge on playing the more varied card, the more flexible card. However, there are obviously instances where playing something that is incredibly niche is worth it, and that's a story for another video. Establish the purpose of the slot and fill it appropriately. If a sideboard slot in your 15 is meant to be an anti-graveyard card, you need to work out if there is another purpose you need to be getting out of that slot. You only have 15 cards you can put in your sideboard. If you have a companion, you only have 14. And in order to get appropriate coverage across everything you expect to face, realistically, you'd be better off with 25 to 30 slots. So anything that's in your sideboard should ideally cover multiple purposes. What does this mean? I want to beat a fast graveyard deck. I also want something against Grixis. Rest in Peace is going to be better than Containment Priest. Rest in Peace hits both of those decks. It's slightly weaker than a Grizzly Bear, like Containment Priest would be, because that can help against things like Show and Tell out of your animated deck. But in general, your Rest in Peace as a purpose, well, your Rest in Peace slot now has 2 purposes, where your Containment Priest has 1. Lastly, maximizing the impact and usage per card. This is very closely attached to the previous point, but basically, every single card in your sideboard needs to be boarded in over the course of a tournament to make sure that your sideboard is good. If you are putting cards in your sideboard and expecting certain matchups and don't run into those matchups, but you can't board those cards in any other matchups that you do encounter, you might need to consider a more flexible option. Realistically, this has a lot of meaning and a lot of different ways you can interpret it. Personally, I try to make sure that every single card in my sideboard gets boarded in a couple of times over the course of a tournament, assuming I play against a relatively normal spread of decks. Otherwise, that's going to be it for today in terms of this presentation. There are lots of different questions that people are going to have about how you choose your sideboard, what cards you're going to be playing. Coming up after this video is going to be a series of the best sideboard cards in every color. I'm also going to go through each of those cards and explain what the purpose is, when you should be playing it, when you shouldn't be playing it. So stick around for those. But otherwise, this is how I personally build my sideboard. These facets and these tenets are going to be relatively useful. They're pretty good rules of thumb, in my opinion. But otherwise, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the chat below. This video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons and donors. If you'd like to support me and my content, feel free to click on the links below and you can put your name up on screen here by supporting. If you like the content, do consider subscribing. It does help grow the channel. It's free for you and you'll be notified of upcoming videos. But otherwise, leave a like if you like the video and I'll catch you next time.